What are the 5 apologetics books that you need to read? Number 1, Tactics. What's beautiful about Tactics is that the majority of apologetics books teach you the arguments, they teach you evidence, they give you summaries, but they don't really teach you how to interact. They don't teach you how to have a discussion. Where does dialogue begin? When it does begin, what do you say? If they say this, how do you respond? That's what Tactics is all about. Tactics is practical, helpful information. You'll learn a lot about rhetoric and logic. Something I really admire about Koukl's book is that it isn't bogged down by complicated terminology. If you're unfamiliar with apologetics or philosophy, when you start reading, you're going to encounter a lot of terminology that you might be unfamiliar with. Koukl, for the most part, abandons traditional terminology and comes up with fun phrases and words of his own. In the beginning of the book, he talks a lot about the importance of asking questions. He relates this to an old TV show in which the detective who would ask a lot of questions was named Columbo. Therefore, he terms the strategy of asking a lot of questions the Columbo. When someone is sending a barrage of questions and objections in your direction, not letting you get a word in, Koukl calls that steamrolling, and he gives advice in the book for how to deal with it. There's a lot of fun terms in here. Self-destruct, sibling rivalry, taking the roof off. Another thing to point out about this book in particular is there's very, very little filler. When I'm reading my books, I like to take a highlighter or a pen and I like to mark the nuggets, the things that really stand out to me. If you look here, I've highlighted or taken notes on almost every single page. There is so much useful information jam-packed in such a small book. Because of how dense and useful information, how practical that information is, and how often I return to this book, Tactics by Gregory Koukl is my number 1. My number 2 is On Guard by William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig is one of the greatest apologists of our time. He's written a number of books and papers, but On Guard in particular is very special because it's intended to be simple. It's comprehensive, but not exhaustive. You'll learn a lot about the most popular arguments. Something I really appreciate personally about Craig is his consistency in his writing. If you ever read a number of his books, or watch the various debates that he's engaged in, or heard some of the writing on his various Reasonable Faith animated videos, you'll notice that Craig is extremely consistent in the words and phrases that he uses. He often repeats himself word for word over a long period of time. This is genius, and the reason is it makes it incredibly easy to digest and memorize Craig's work. The more you engage with his content, the more you will understand and remember his content. Another aspect of this book that's really fun are these really cool argument maps. So these are going to kind of map out how the conversation could go. They might start with this, and then you could respond with this. They might then counter with this, but then you know that this is the proper answer to that. Granted, no conversation will perfectly follow form, but they're very useful principles to remember in dialogue. Because of how much ground it covers, how digestible it is, and how useful the information is, On Guard is my number 2. My number 3 is going to have to be The Universe Next Door by James W. Sire. What's amazing about Sire's book is that he frames the whole conversation in terms of worldview. A worldview is how you see the world. It's actually how you answer worldview questions. So the book begins by Sire asking 8 worldview questions, and depending on the way that you answer the questions, that will determine the worldview that you believe. These are questions like, what is prime reality, the really real? What is a human being? What happens to a person at death? How do we know right from wrong? What is the meaning of human history? And he explains how each of those worldviews would answer all 8 questions. This is a really great way to learn about other religions and philosophies and understand Christianity within the context of those worldviews. When you learn different principles to discern between worldviews, the quest for truth becomes a lot simpler. Most people are under the assumption that there are so many religions and so many philosophies out there that you couldn't possibly know which one is true. But the fact is that all these worldviews exist under greater umbrellas, and there's a finite amount of these umbrellas. When you learn what questions to ask and what to look for, you can really narrow it down. Lastly, I want to mention how useful worldview worldview questions are in conversations. You don't know how to begin a spiritual conversation? Ask a worldview question. People actually enjoy answering these questions. People like talking about themselves. Give them the opportunity. Ask them what they think happens to a person at death. Ask them what they think the meaning of human history is. Ask them where they think all of this came from or what it all means. And when you lead them through the worldview questions, then you can begin a dialogue about what worldview they actually align with. Because of how helpful the universe next door is in understanding Christianity within the context of other faiths and philosophies, and because of how useful worldview questions are in conversation, the universe next door is my number 3. For those of you who know me personally, you might be surprised by my number 4, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. The reason I say it's a surprise is because Mere Christianity is my personal favorite book of all time. I've read it over a dozen times and counting. If you've never read a C.S. Lewis book, you should. Mere Christianity is one of his greatest works, and it's considered by many to be the blueprint for modern-day apologetics books. The first 5 chapters actually cover the axiological argument, otherwise known as the moral argument. But there's a lot more than the moral argument in this book. C.S. Lewis covers determinism, the Trinity, the problem of evil and suffering, sanctification, and a host of other important topics. Another important aspect of Mere Christianity is that it outlines orthodoxy. It perfectly intertwines apologetics, theology, and discipleship into one cohesive narrative. And what's more, the entire thing is whimsical and fun from start to finish. It's a book that I'm probably going to be reading for the rest of my life. And for that reason, it's my number 4. My number 5 is The Reason for God by Timothy Keller. A great segue into Keller's book is the fact that a lot of people herald Keller as a modern-day C.S. Lewis. He is a huge fan. While growing a church in New York, Keller actually learned how to engage with the common person. Instead of getting wrapped up in ivory tower philosophy, Keller was tackling more common objections. Questions that some philosophers would easily dismiss, Keller addresses with passion. Even though Keller is wildly intelligent, he's extremely down-to-earth and relatable. The introduction literally starts with a Darth Vader quote, "I find your lack of faith disturbing." How can you not love Keller? This book was pivotal in my personal walk, and in the same way that Mere Christianity is both an apologetics book and a discipleship book, The Reason for God accomplishes the same. I've read all of Keller's books, and I'm a fan of all of them, but the quintessential Keller book is The Reason for God. And for that reason, it's my number 5. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have you read any of these books, and what do you think of them? And what are your favorite apologetics books, and why? If you have great book suggestions, leave it in the comments so all of us can learn from each other. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.